Welcome to Transform Yourself Radio, the podcast that shines a light on the secrets behind physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual transformation. I'm your host, Adam Farr, and I'm here to teach you how to transform your body, your mind, and your life once and for all. Stay tuned, I have a great show for you today. The subject of today's episode is how to improve your microbiome. There's a problem I've come across in the last couple of years that I've uncovered through my many conversations with my clients and with people interested in optimizing their health at the most fundamental levels. And the problem I've uncovered is that there is a lack of understanding of what it means to be human at the biological level. What is a human being? And very few people, if I were to ask them that question, very few people will give me a very detailed or well thought out answer. What it is to be human, biologically. What are we made of, right? And of course, there's some obvious answers, right? We are made of tissues, we're made of cells, we have organs, we have a brain. A lot of people will say that a lot of our self, who we are, really resides in here, at the negation of everything that's happening below, which is not true, by the way. One of the biggest problems with the typical definition of what it means to be a human being is that there's a very important discovery that has been disregarded by many people. Or rather, they're just not aware of it, right? And the discovery is that you have this organ, this hidden organ in your body, newly discovered in the last few decades, let's say. And this organ is your microbiome. It's the community of microbes and creatures living inside your gut, and they act together, they work together to create almost something like an organ. It functions like an organ. Their combined activities are just like an organ, a newly discovered organ. And this is hard for a lot of people to wrap their heads around, especially when I tell them that, in recent decades, what we've discovered is that these bacteria, these microorganisms living in your gut, and the entirety of all the microorganisms in your body, called your holobiome, by the way, microorganisms on your skin, in your sinuses, in your gut, everywhere, all of these organisms taken together form about 90% or more of the total amount of DNA that you are expressing every day. So most of your DNA, the number is higher by some estimates, but I'm going to be conservative. So all of your DNA, or the majority of your DNA, is not even human DNA. It's not even mammalian DNA. It's microbial DNA. And so the question arises, what does it mean to be a human being? Biologically, what is a human being? And the truth is, a human being really is just a big bag of bacteria. It's a host organism. Your mammalian cells host bacterial cells. Isn't that interesting? And it's very important to understand this premise, this distinction, because if you don't understand what it is to be human biologically, you'll have great difficulty in finding health or optimizing your health at the physiological level if you don't realize that you are actually made up of mostly bacteria. Bacterial DNA, bacterial cells. This is important. And so what that means is, if you're made mostly of bacteria and you want to promote the health of your body, really the mindset you have to adopt is that you want to promote the health of your bacteria. The many species of bacteria that live inside your body, when you eat, when you detoxify, when you make decisions about how you're going to improve yourself on a physical level, really those decisions are about how you're going to improve the health of the microbial creatures living inside of you and on you. That's really what you have to attempt to do. And this is the first step in understanding why we do the things we do to improve our health, why there are specific steps to take, why there's a specific sequence to improving your health. And one of the very first steps is improving the health of your microbiome, this hidden organ, this newly discovered organ that is really kind of like a coral reef, if you will. Look at it this way. If you go scuba diving and you find yourself in a coral reef, you'll notice that there's an entire web of life that supports that reef system. The reef itself, the coral, is kind of like a framework, and then all the fish and all the aquatic creatures that live inside the reef, well, they support the ecosystem that is the reef, that makes it so beautiful and diverse. And your body's much the same. Your body is like its own reef. Your mammalian cells are like the coral, and your mammalian cells, really set up a place or a framework for all these other creatures to live in. And there's a symbiotic relationship happening where one species will promote the genesis or the proliferation of another species, which will promote the proliferation of another, right? Everything is eating itself, essentially. And so you need one species to provide food for another, which provides food for another, and you have this cycle of life, right? Everything eats itself over and over and over again. And if you remove one keystone species from that coral reef, if you remove one key predator or one key microbe in that ecosystem of life, well, then the entire ecosystem will suffer, will shift in order to find balance again. This is why the problem of the fact that we're destroying the earth and there's a mass extinction going on right now. There's a mass extinction going on due to human interaction with the planet. It's why it's so destabilizing for not only the climate, but also the ecosystems of the planet and our ability to produce food and agriculture. And all these questions arise. It could get really complex. But if you harm one species, if one thing is missing, the entire system will go haywire. And it'll take a while for it to recover and find that balance again. And so that's what your body is. It's a reef. And 90% or more of your reef is made up of other creatures that you must serve, being the conscious human being that you are, being aware of these principles. You must serve them in order for them to serve you. You must make the right choices in the food you're consuming, the drinks you're consuming, right? Your lifestyle habits. You must make the right choices in order to support their lives, because in turn, they're going to be symbiotic to what you need, and they're going to help you produce vitamins and absorb minerals and fight off infection and all kinds of interesting things if you're aware of what you are. What is a human being? You're a reef. You're a gardener. You're tending to your garden, and you must make sure that everything within the garden has what it needs if you want to have a beautiful garden that produces what you need to produce in order to sustain life, your life. So the definition you have of a human body and what it is, that's the first most important step to creating a paradigm shift in your understanding of why we do what we do in order to get healthy. Why there's specific steps to take in order to make your body function optimally. To get rid of FST syndrome, right? Fat, sick, and tired syndrome. You might have heard me write about this. But how do you lose weight, get rid of chronic illness and disease, and how do you regain your energy? So a very interesting and important thing to consider is how many people have a condition called dysbiosis of the microbiome. In other words, the bacterial populations that exist in their gut and throughout their body, perhaps. Well, these bacterial populations are not in balance. They're not in the right ratio. There's not enough quality bacteria. There's not enough good bacteria in relation to the bad bacteria. There's not enough species of microorganisms that serve you versus the ones that rob you of energy, that are more parasitic in nature. And this second brain, this gut, this tube, will take in food from your environment, and it will receive molecules from that food, and it'll make decisions about what's happening in the environment and change the balance of chemistry, the physiological processes in your body accordingly based on the information it's getting from the outside. The same way you receive light into your eyeball and you're able to see, oh, there's an object there, there's an obstacle, I don't want to bump into it, so I'm going to move around the obstacle. Well, your microbiome, your gut, your GI tract, has a similar process. It's almost a thinking process, subconscious, of course, where you receive food, which is information from the environment. It goes into your GI tract. Your microbiome interacts with these molecules, and these microorganisms then say, hey, there's something out there in the environment that we need to either avoid or move towards. And the constituents of your microbiotic environment will dictate what kind of decisions your biology will make in order to either avoid obstacles or move towards something that is life-giving, that's health-promoting. And so your gut is a second brain. And the microbiome, the microorganisms that live within your gut, are the neurons that communicate with each other to help make decisions that have implications for the rest of your body. And remember, I told you that over 90% of your genome is actually microbial DNA. 90% of your genetic expression comes from these bacteria. You're mostly bacterial DNA. Very little of you is mammalian or human DNA. And what does this mean when you eat something? It means that the food you consume will have an epigenetic influence, which means an environmental influence on your genes. That your bacteria, because they have a shorter life cycle, they will receive the food, and as they proliferate, as they reproduce, well, the stressors perceived by one bacteria as it reproduces itself into other bacteria, well, the stressor from its life, from its environment, will be passed on to the next one. And as it splits or as it reproduces itself, the genes that are responsible for allowing an organism or a microorganism to adapt to its environment, well, some of those genes will be turned on in the following generation of microbes that live in your gut. They're always reproducing, right? Let me give you an example of this. A great example, actually, is the example of Romanian orphans. I believe it was in the 80s. There was a crisis of orphans in Romania back in the 80s. I don't have great details on this, but I'll give you the basic premise here. And there were so many orphans, and a lot of these orphans were adopted, brought into the Western world. But because these orphans lived in conditions of very poor nutrition, mental, emotional neglect, right? When they were brought to the United States and Canada and brought into this culture of plentifulness, of excess, they had already been programmed at the genetic level, at the epigenetic level, the environmental level. Their genes had already been programmed to have a bias towards thinking that there was not enough in the environment, not enough food, not enough vitamins and minerals, right? Not enough love and connection. And so epigenetically, these Romanian orphans who came to Canada and the United States, well, they came here pre-programmed to exist in an environment that had a lot of scarcity. But then they come into this environment that has a lot of excess. And so what happened with these Romanian orphans is that a lot of them were genetically pre-programmed to gain weight, to have chronic illness and disease, to have mental, emotional issues or perceptions that were basically false perceptions about the reality of their social experiences, if you will. And that's all because they were pre-programmed as children in an environment that in order to survive, you must be pre-programmed to adapt to a scarce environment. You must lower your metabolism. You must slow everything down. You must hang on to the calories you consume in order to make it in that area. Well, the bacteria in your gut do the same thing from one generation to another. And so the Romanian orphans that live here now in North America, they're going to have children as well. And that genetic code, that genetic expression, right? Those blueprints for surviving and thriving in an environment of scarcity, well, those are going to be passed on to their children. And guess what? Because of that, their children are going to be more likely to be obese. to have mental emotional issues, to hang on to every calorie they consume, and they will be more likely to have health problems. Why? Because their mother, who experienced this as a child, has now passed on that programming to them. Your bacteria do the same thing. If you are killing your bacteria or you're stressing your good bacteria, right, there's going to be a shift in how these bacterial genes express themselves. And there's going to be a shift in how you absorb energy and how you absorb nutrients, how you digest your food, how you produce hormones. There's going to be a cascade of events that happens that will dictate your ability to be healthy with ease, or if you have difficulty becoming healthy. Again, this goes back to my definition. What does it mean to be human? Well, if it means that you're made mostly of bacteria, and that the stressors imposed on these microbes living in your body are ultimately defined by the food you put in your mouth and the information that is given to these bacteria from that epigenetic or that environmental stimulus, the food, right? If your genes alter themselves and their genetic behavior and how they proliferate and what they do, if that gets altered by what you eat, then literally the food you eat is altering your genes. And it's turning certain genes on and certain genes off. Some genes are being expressed and they don't need to be expressed. Your fat genes, the genes that make you gain weight. There's a program that's being initiated. Why? Because your microbes in your gut are sensing something in the environment that says, we are required to make this organism, this reef, put on fat. Because that is going to help ensure the survival of the reef and therefore us. And that's what happens. If you're consuming something in the food you eat, some sort of toxin, or you're exposing yourself to some sort of pathogen, then your microbial bacteria will recognize that, they will sense that, right? They have receptors to sense these kinds of stressors as well. And they're going to turn on genes that are responsible for creating disease states and disease processes. And you might say, well, how does that confer a survival advantage to turn on a disease process? Well, it does, believe it or not. Disease processes are actually the way your body responds to stressors in the outside environment and tries to extend the life of the organism in that particular toxic environment. A great example of this is cancer. Cancer, or a tumor, let's say, a cancerous cell is an anaerobic metabolizer, right? All cancers or cancerous cells have this in common. They ferment for energy. They use glucose for energy, and they are very poor metabolizers of fat. It's for this reason that if you consume a carbohydrate-rich diet when you have cancer, that you're going to be feeding the cancer cells. So what are the cancer cells fermenting? Well, they're fermenting sugar, which is a toxin, but they're also metabolizing the toxins that are in your environment, right? The hormones that have built up in your tissue, the antibiotics that have built up in your tissue, the glyphosate, the pesticides, right? These things have built up in your tissue for years. And what a tumor is, or what cancer cells do that confers advantage to the host organism, believe it or not, is that they absorb and metabolize this toxic waste. The same way a mushroom on the forest floor will proliferate and grow in areas where the soil has too much toxicity and nothing else could grow there except the fungus. The fungus is providing a valuable process for the forest ecosystem. It is making sure that everything remains in balance by being that niche organism that has specialized in using toxins and toxic metabolites to proliferate itself, to make itself grow. And so it's getting rid of toxins for someone else, and it's using it to feed itself. That's what a mushroom or a fungus will do. A cancer cell is very similar. The reason your body will start to initiate or produce these cancer cells is because the cells are in an environment that requires that this particular problem be addressed. And for the health of the organism, for the health of the entire reef or the entire garden, in order to ensure that everyone survives longer, right? Well, what does your body do? It produces a tumor or cancerous mass, which essentially takes care of that. Now, we know that cancer is a pretty grave disease, and this doesn't mean that you're going to survive over the long term. Fine, but you do survive longer because of the cancer, longer than you otherwise would if these toxins simply poisoned your blood and shut down your organs, right? If your blood becomes too toxic, if those toxins have nowhere to go and your organs are already worn out at this point, then your body will probably allow a cancer to take place in order to effect the change it needs and keep your blood and your lymph clean. Because if the blood becomes toxic, the organs will shut down. That includes the brain, and you'll die quicker. And so, in that sense, cancer serves to keep you alive longer, right? It gets more complex here. It's a lot more complex. There are other explanations I'm not going to get into here. But the mechanism you must understand is that there's toxicity in the environment and there's a proliferation of these types of cells which feed off of that toxicity. In the same way that if you introduce toxins into your body, or sugary foods, or polyunsaturated fatty acids, there are organisms that exist in your gut and in nature that will feed off of those toxins. But you don't want them to get out of control. You don't want them to be imbalanced. You don't want to have too many species that are running rampant in your aquatic ecosystem. You want there to be balance amongst all the species, and you want there to be a symbiosis so that the reef functions well. It's a life-giving reef. The same is true for your gut. Now, when it comes to the question of health, you could narrow things down to two forces. The forces of deficiency, not enough of something, not enough vitamins, minerals, not enough water, not enough air. Deficiency syndromes and toxicity syndromes, too much of. Too many toxins, too much sugar, too many negative thoughts. These are toxicities. The combination of the two, combined with a unifying force called flow for me, which is, the process of moving everything in your body. Blood is pumping, thoughts are flowing, you're breathing air, there's movement to life, right? Well, this is what keeps, these three factors are what keep the human body in a balance, right? The balance between deficiency, toxicity, and flow. When you don't have flow, you have congestion. This is a big problem. And so many people have a problem with digestion and absorption of their food. And this, again, relates back to the microbiome. The microbiome is responsible for, or these microbes are responsible for taking your food stuff, taking these molecules, and doing something with it in the structure of their own cell, of their own cellular body, and turning it into something that is useful to the entire community, to the coral and the coral reef, and then all the fish and wildlife that lives within the coral reef. They are responsible for that. And so your ability to absorb nutrients and to digest and to be free of pathogenic infection and toxicity syndromes is ultimately dependent on whether you have enough of the good bacteria in relation to the bad bacteria, whether your ecosystem is in balance. Now, I talk about two forces here. I talk about deficiency and toxicity as if they're separate, but they're one and the same, because having a deficiency problem in your body, having a lack of vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients, enzymes, having a lack of these things will also create, down the line, a chain of events that leads to a toxicity, and vice versa. Having excess, having too many toxins in your body will create a chain of events that leads to a deficiency. And so they go hand in hand. There is no such thing as a deficiency without a resulting toxicity, and there's no such thing as a toxicity without a resulting deficiency. And both of these things imply congestion of sorts, a lack of flow within the body. Your body is like a river. It must flow. Things must circulate. This concept, by the way, is one of the reasons why people who don't eat so well, who make poor food choices, but they're very physically active, they kind of still look good. Because despite all their deficiencies and toxicities, they have so much flow, so much pressure of lymphatic pumping and blood pumping, that all the mechanisms of their body that require that flow to process the toxins and to move nutrients around to avoid deficiencies, all those processes are upregulated. And so they, not that they get away with it, because they don't. It does catch up to them. But they look better than the rest of us naked, because at least in one area, the fundamental area, flow, right? The flow of blood, the flow of lymph, the flow of nutrients, the flow of toxins, so they get excreted. At least in this one area, they seem to optimize it by being physically active. When it comes to your microbiome, there's a chain of events that'll happen when you don't have the right microbial species living inside of you. If you don't have the right microbes in your body, or you're not feeding these microbes, then one of the big and most impactful things that will happen is that you'll start to have problems producing endogenously B vitamins. The B vitamins that your body produces comes from these microbes, right? These microbes are what are taking the food you eat and they're turning it into a B vitamin. And a B vitamin is used almost ubiquitously throughout the entire body for every cell, every enzymatic process. Everything you could think of requires some sort of a B vitamin, because it has to do with energy metabolism in the mitochondria, right? So B vitamins are very important. But if you don't have the right microbial balance, if you have dysbiosis of the microbiome, then what happens is you become B vitamin deficient. And then a cascade of events begins to happen. I'll give you one example. If you lack B vitamins, then you're starting to erode away at the mucosal lining of your stomach in order to use the mucus to get more B vitamins. This is what your microbes do, right? You start to produce less hydrochloric acid, the acidity you need to break down food, the acidity you need to destroy pathogens that find their way into the stomach, the acidity you need to break down proteins and make them smaller. And because you don't produce hydrochloric acid in your stomach as well, then you have a problem, because larger molecules find their way into the bloodstream. And this creates an immune response. And the immune response causes inflammation, which causes more tissue damage. And the tissue damage leads to organ dysfunction and cellular dysfunction, which leads to the symptoms of disease. But what is the root? It's your gut. You have a leaky gut. You're not feeding your microbes the things they need to produce their B vitamins and whatever, you're not feeding them what they need in order to do the job of keeping the microbial community, 90% of your genes, functioning optimally within balance, so that the genes you're expressing are the type of genes that promote life, not the type of genes that put you in survival mode, like a disease state, not the type of genes that, were they to be turned on, you would have the symptoms of disease. So if you have fat, sick, and tired syndrome, if you're overweight, if you're chronically ill, or you have a disease state, you have a diagnosis of some kind, right? And you're constantly fatigued, well, at the root, at the very, very root of that is the microbes in your gut. How do you help them do what they're supposed to do to keep you healthy? They are you. You're mostly bacteria. So the way that I've come to appreciate the impact that this information can have on your health has been with working with my clients and working especially with people who consider themselves to be difficult cases. The people whom no one else has been able to help because of the complexities of their particular condition. By the time they get to me, I like to say that they have knots on top of knots on top of knots on their shoe. And this shoe represents their health. And they want to remove the shoe and replace it with a new one. But you have all these knots that keep it on. And the job of a coach like myself, a health professional, is to look at that shoe and look at those knots and start untying them one by one by one. And the difficult cases are usually the people who've accumulated knots on top of knots on top of knots. So many of the women that I work with are in this kind of situation. They're difficult cases. No one has ever been able to help them or inform them on what matters most, or the sequence of events they must go through in order to remove these knots in their physiology, in their health, in their metabolism. Hormonally, they're knotted up. What is the first thing you have to do? One of the first knots you must untie is the problem of dysbiosis. You must create microbial balance in the gut, and there's a way to do that. And, a little backstory here about how your microbiome, how your immune system is generated in the first place is through the process of a natural birth. When you are in gestation, when you're in the womb of your mother and you have a vaginal birth, which is what's supposed to happen, by the way, a vaginal birth, the child comes through the vaginal canal and exits the mother through the vagina, right? And upon exit, the face is literally swabbed with lactobacillus microbes. These are milk digesting microbes. They're literally swabbed on the face of the child because these microbes will literally migrate down to the vaginal area before birth and provide that immune boosting inoculation of microbes to the child at the very beginning of its life to prepare it for the environment. Why lactobacillus? Think about it. The child's going to be reared on human milk. And so you need the bacteria that digest the human milk to produce the B vitamins that will otherwise promote the growth of the child. You need them to be in the child. And so you get your first inoculation in that way. And then the child breastfeeds and he even gets skin microbes from the holobiome. It gets skin microbes on the breast of the mother by being close physically with the mother. And you may have heard of studies of children who were not breastfed and who were not held, how they die. Well, why do they die? They die because they don't have an immune system that is seeded by microbes. That's one of the reasons they die physiologically. They don't die for some magical reason. There's a physiological reason these children will die. They're missing the seeding of the microbiome. And so if you're someone who has trouble losing weight, then one of the processes I use is I imagine that you could take an adult and you could reseed their microbiome in the same way that it would be seeded in the birthing process. And this is through microbes that feed on milk. There's a way to do this. I'm going to get into this. There's a very specific way to do this. You're not going to have to be reborn again to make it happen. But there is a specific protocol I use with my clients to reseed and repopulate their microbiome in the same sequence that it would occur if you were just born and you were growing up over the span of 1, 2, 3 years. What is the sequence of events that would happen, and how do you mimic that and replicate that for an adult who needs that to happen in order to lose weight, get healthy, stop disease, and have energy again? What these health issues come down to is the forces I mentioned earlier: deficiency syndromes, toxicity syndromes, too little of something, too much of something. And of course, the effect of having too little or too much is a problem with flow. You create congestion. The river no longer flows, the river of life. Your blood, your lymph, they don't flow properly. And so there's a lack of this pressure that allows nutrients to be passed from one area to another, or toxins to be moved from one area to another in order to be excreted. Toxins are excreted and nutrients are absorbed. Deficiency, toxicity, all comes down to this overarching idea of flow. You don't want to be congested. You don't want your cells to be congested. You don't want your organs to be congested. So what are you deficient in? Well, for one, you're deficient in the right microbes, which are the probiotics, right? And you might think, oh, it's good enough for me to take a supplement in order to address that deficiency. Not so, all right? Not so. Be careful about the supplement industry. It is not regulated, and it is a great way to burn a lot of money that you don't want to burn. So you're deficient in the right microbes, probiotics. You're deficient in prebiotics, the things that these microbes consume, that they need to make the B vitamins, that they need to make or help you to make the right acids and salts and enzymes, right? You're deficient in that. You're deficient in some fundamental stuff, very likely. You're probably deficient in vitamin D, because many of us don't get enough exposure to the sun, at least with a lot of our body completely exposed. You're probably deficient in zinc because of the state of our agricultural practices and the erosion of the topsoil and the fact that a lot of us are consuming food from factory farms, and so you're getting this food, but it's missing a lot of what it really needs to be functional in your body. You're probably missing magnesium for the same reasons. And you're probably not consuming enough fish oils. That's EPA, DHA. These are fundamental things, right? I call these 4 things the core 4: zinc, magnesium, D3, EPA, DHA. You consume those, you correct a lot of deficiency problems that will lead to toxicity, that will lead to congestion. That's one. The other thing that you might be deficient in are the acids in your stomach that allow you to begin the breakdown process of proteins and whatnot from your diet. And so that's called hydrochloric acid. And you want to take a hydrochloric acid that has gentian root in it and pepsin, which is an enzyme, and they have their own functions. But then you also want to take something like ox bile, which is very basic in nature. So you have the acid and you have the base. Base would be the bile salts, which will allow the enzymes to take action within the body and actually break down further within the small intestine. And then, of course, you have enzymes. You have the full spectrum of pancreatic enzymes, which is probably the most important. Going back to my discussion about cancer, one of the things that almost all cancer patients have in common is they have a tired pancreas. And it's the pancreatic enzymes, believe it or not, that will digest and break down the cancer cells. But you must have a full spectrum. And this must be done in a very specific way. You don't just take these pills and expect your cancer to go away. There's a lot more to it than that. So I'm not going to give too much information. I don't want you to act on anything inappropriately. But there's pancreatic enzymes, and then there's the other enzymes, the ones in your mouth, the amylases, the ones that digest starch, right? You have the lipases. These are the ones that break down fat. And you have the proteases. These are the ones that break down protein. These are things you may be deficient in. I talk about the core four often. I talk about the digestive dual, the hydrochloric acids, the salts, and the acids, and the enzymes. I talk about these things because these are steps to take to address deficiency, and they will have an effect on your microbiome, and your body will begin to balance itself, to regulate itself, because key factors in the process of creating balance, homeostatic balance within your body, key processes are then going to be supplemented. And underlying reasons for dis-ease, for disruption in your normal metabolic processes will be addressed by using very simple procedures and steps that give your body a chance to act normal, to function properly and optimally. And it's very easy to address deficiencies in the human body because a deficiency means a lack of. And in our culture, when you have a lack of something, you supplement with it. We take a magic pill, if you will. I've described a few of them. And that's easy. That's very user-friendly. We like that. Hey, you got a problem? Here's a pill. Here's a tonic. Here's a tea. It's magical. It's going to help you. Not so, necessarily, right? There's more to it than that. Some of these things certainly do help, but you have to take that information in context. Why do they help? What is the state of the organism? What's actually causing the problem? Is it a deficiency or is it more so a toxicity? Right? Deficiencies lead to toxicities. Toxicities lead to deficiency. But what's at the root of it? And I found that when it comes to toxicity, the issue is congestion. Congestion, right? And that could be caused by a lot of things. It could be caused by the thoughts you think. You may be congested. And one of the primary areas of congestion in the human body is the colon. People do not go to the bathroom and defecate enough. And so what happens is their fecal matter stays in their colon, right? And it stays way past its due date. It stays way longer than it should. And you have toxic fecal matter that should be excreted, should be passing out of you at a certain rate because of flow, because of peristaltism, should be coming out of you, but it remains and it gets reabsorbed. And the metabolites and the toxins and the pathogens that should have been evacuated from a normally functioning bowel will remain and get reabsorbed, and they'll create toxicity in the blood. And then your liver will have to do more work, right? So because your colon is congested, your liver will have to spend more time detoxifying the blood that is becoming more and more toxic as a result of this lazy colon. And so now your liver gets congested as well. What do we call that? Cirrhosis of the liver, fatty liver, enlarged liver, right? Many people who have weight problems, who have chronic illness and disease, have a problem with their liver. Why? Because it's a toxicity organ. It's the organ that addresses toxicity in the body for the entire body. Very important organ. And then what happens? Now you have a congested colon and a congested liver. So you're developing gallbladder stones, intrahepatic gallstones. You don't go to the bathroom very often. You have a crappy attitude. You're in a shitty mood, right? You're angry. Your liver holds anger, right? And now this is going to spread to your kidneys, to your stomach, right? The congestion spreads. You have a blockage in one area of your plumbing system, and then the blockage will get bigger and bigger and bigger the more crap you pour down the tubes, the more supplements you have, the more food you consume, right? So you could consume all the supplementation and all the nutritious food you want. It has all this stuff. But if your pipes are clogged, literally the tubes that connect your organs together and your blood vessels, if they're literally congested, they're slow moving, then you have a toxicity crisis due to that, due to congestion, not due to a deficiency. And this is something you have to address. Or it spreads. It spreads to your kidneys, then it spreads to your skin. Now you have a skin condition. It spreads to your lungs. Now you have asthma, right? You have heavy metals floating around your body. They're not being chelated. They're not being removed in the way they should through natural processes that your body is equipped to handle them with. Why? Because you have congestion. It's blocked. So what you want to do is you want to reseed your microbiome. You want to give your microbiome a chance to bring new genetic wealth and information to the entire system. So you change the way everything interacts with itself, right? You reintroduce the keystone species into the coral reef, right? You reintroduce them into the environment, and the environment finds balance again. This is why reseeding the microbiome is so important. But there's a way to do that. I believe it begins with an elimination diet, like a carnivore style diet. Of course, I would only suggest such a diet if you're promoting digestion and absorption using the Core 4 supplements and the digestive duo I mentioned earlier. Otherwise, you won't be able to handle that level of protein and those organ meats. You're going to have trouble digesting them. You're going to cause more problems. So there's circumstances, there's context to be taken into account here. But I believe you start with an elimination diet that removes anything that would otherwise rock the boat metabolically for your body. You don't want to encourage the immune system to be active. You don't want to have inflammatory processes going on in your body. You want to make it as easy as possible for your body to consume the energy it needs and to start working towards creating balance throughout the entire system. And you do this by encouraging an elimination diet under the right preconditions. After a period of time where you've been on this strict elimination diet and the symptoms of disease or illness or weight gain, they start to recede. In other words, you get thinner, you're burning body fat, you're in ketosis. Your energy improves, mental clarity improves, your mood and your emotions balance themselves out. Your ability to think and hold on to information improves, right? The symptoms of your disease begin to dissipate. If you have a skin condition, your skin becomes clear and more healthy, right? If you're losing your hair, you start to regrow your hair. If you have metabolic diseases, then the symptoms of those diseases begin to dissipate as well, right? The symptoms of your disease improve. And after being on this kind of diet for a while, you could say, okay, my immune system has calmed down. Everything's kind of more relaxed. Now I could reintroduce something that, were it not for the preconditions I've set up where my immune system is relaxed, now I could reintroduce something that might otherwise make my immune system overreactive again. And what would that be? Dairy, right? But we want to reintroduce it because if you use fermented dairy, I'm talking about yogurt here and kefir, things of that nature, if you use fermented dairy in the right amounts at the right time, you could reseed your microbiome with these lactobacillus bacteria. And you could give your microbiome a second chance to start over. You get to push into your body bacteria that you know will benefit you, right? And push out competing negative bacteria, parasitic bacteria. You could push them out and you'll get to repopulate yourself with somewhat of a newborn child's microbiome. Is this a fact? No, this is something that I've been doing and it seems to work very, very well. Over time, what will happen is you'll get to reintroduce other forms of bacteria through fermented foods like sauerkraut and kimchi, vegetable ferments, fruit ferments. There's different bacteria from different prebiotic sources. I'm going to give you 5 steps to healing your microbiome. 5 steps. They must be done in this order. And just a little disclaimer here. Do not do this on your own, all right? There are subtleties, there's pieces of information, there's context to take into account. Do this with the help of someone who's done it before. Don't think that these 5 steps, in the way that I'm going to describe them, in the very vague way I'm going to describe them, will give you enough information and enough context to make the right decision for yourself. But what are the 5 steps? The first step is always to consume the core 4 and the digestive duo. What are the core 4 again? Zinc, I suggest liquid zinc, liquid EPA DHA, a magnesium supplement. I use magnesium bisglycinate, magnesium, EPA DHA, and D3. Those are your core 4. Almost everyone is deficient in those particular nutrients. Do you have to be on them the rest of your life? Absolutely not. There's a way to dose these. There's a timeline to follow. There's a very specific structure. And that's part of step 1. The second part of step 1 is to improve your digestion. And you do this by incorporating acids and bases. What are the acids? Hydrochloric acid is your main acid here. Acids and bases and enzymes. So your duo, with respect to what I'm talking about here, the digestive duo, is your acids and bases is one, and your enzymes is the other. So acids and bases means hydrochloric acid and a mixture of gentian root and pepsin in there, which will promote digestive processes and breakdown processes you need to promote. That's number 1. And ox bile. Ox bile is the base. It's more neutral in its acidity. And it's the environment where the enzymes take action. And some people, or many people actually, have a congested liver, congested gallbladder. And so their bile gets stuck in their liver, creates these intrahepatic gallstones, and they're not excreting enough bile from their gallbladder and from their liver in order to create an environment where enzymes could take the action they need to take to break down the proteins and the starches and the fats, which is within the medium of bile. And so you have your acids and you have your bases. That's the first part of the digestive duo. The second part are the enzymes. And many people who have health problems also have a tired pancreas. And so you want the full spectrum of pancreatic enzymes so that you can support the process of breaking down proteins in your body. The proteins, the very same proteins you need to rebuild your cell walls, your cell structure, your DNA, you need these proteins for everything in your body. And if you don't have enough pancreatic enzymes, guess what? Despite all the protein you're consuming, you become protein deficient. And the unabsorbed, poorly digested proteins become a toxin in your body. So you have a deficiency and a toxicity that occurs at the same time because of a lack of pancreatic enzymes. Then, of course, as I mentioned, there's the other enzymes, the lipases and the amylases. You could get supplements for that as well. And this takes care of step 1. Once you've set the stage with step 1, you've gotten your core 4 supplements, you've received your digestive duo supplements. Right? Now you can move on to step 2. You've addressed the major problems with digestion and absorption that most of us have after we've accumulated health problems over the years. Now the next step is with these supplements, with these tools that will help break the cycle of illness and disease and overweightness and fatigue. Once you have these tools, now you could adopt a type of diet you would otherwise not be able to adopt without these tools. And that is a carnivore style diet. You're all the way at the extreme of the spectrum of diets, right? On the one hand, you have veganism, and on the other hand, you have carnivore. You're all the way on the carnivore side, and you're consuming almost exclusively animal meat, organ meat especially, right? From the right animals, organic, grass-fed, grass-finished, antibiotic-free, hormone-free, free-range, pasture-raised. These are the types of animal products you must consume, not the types of food you get from a factory farm. These are diseased animals. They are unhealthy, unhappy animals. Do not consume food from these animals if you're going to go on a carnivore diet that's meant to heal you. You want healthy, happy animals. And so you set yourself up on this very, very strict elimination diet that has everything you need in it from eating very few sources of food, right? It's almost an autoimmune style diet. If you have the right preconditions, only if, all right? There's complexities here. What I'm saying is not an absolute statement. There are many things to take into account with respect to deficiency, toxicity, stress management. There's a lot of context. This is why you work with a professional who understands. But now you adopt this carnivore diet and you get all the nutrients you need from the organ meats. You get all the protein you need. You get all the fats from these very high quality animal products. And you feed your body and give it everything it needs through the consumption of these things on the carnivore diet. That's step 2. Step 3 is you wait. You wait for the signs and symptoms of fat, sick, and tired syndrome to dissipate. You lose weight, that's a good sign. The symptoms of your disease dissipate, that's a good sign. You start to get more energy, mental clarity, and focus, that's a great sign. And you stay in that zone of improvement for a while until you've been there for a little bit and you say, hey, you know what? I've been here for about a month or two, and I bet my immune system right now is much more relaxed than it was before. Great. At this point, I feel less concerned about reintroducing new things into my diet. I could start now bringing back certain key nutritional elements. Fermented foods is what I'm talking about here. I could bring those back and I could reintroduce them into my diet in order to help reseed my diet. At this point, we haven't been reseeding the microbiome. We've only been eliminating things that would get in the way of that. And so that's step 3. Step 4 is to begin the process of reseeding the microbiome with fermented foods. You start off with dairy fermented foods, lactobacillus. And it starts off with small pieces of well-fermented yogurt. And you move all the way up to very strong ferments of kefir. But you do it very gradually with a lot of structure behind it. You don't just do it randomly. If you have a histamine intolerance, you have to be very careful here. So there's a process there. And then as you become accustomed to the dairy, if you can even be accustomed to it, as that happens, you could start introducing microbes from other fermented food, from fermented vegetables. And now there's a very important thing to understand here. Fermented foods that you have that are grown in a garden, well, the types of microbes living on that piece of produce depend on the microbes in the soil it was grown in. And if you grow your food, or if you attain your food from some sort of factory farming operation, or from some commercial establishment that puts pesticides in the soil and chemical fertilizers and all kinds of stuff in the soil, if they have a soil environment, a topsoil environment that is not natural, that's not healthy, then the food you're consuming will not have its own microbiome that it will lend to you when you undergo the fermentation process for that particular vegetable. So for this reason, having your own home garden, if you have to heal at this level, will have tremendous benefits. With real soil that has its own microbial diversity, its own microbiome, its own species of bacteria and fungi, which will make the plants that you grow in that soil extremely healthy and disease resistant. Going back to step 3, how do you know that you're ready to move on to step 4 and start to introduce these particular ferments into your diet, the dairy ones and the vegetable ferments? Well, quite simply, you have more energy, like I said, you're sleeping better. There's little sign of toxicity from your body, so you don't have stinky sweat. Your urine is not very dark, right? Your bowel movements don't smell. You don't have bad breath. These are all signs that your body is not very toxic anymore. And this is almost permission to start doing the ferments at that point. It could be earlier, but there has to be a major improvement in all the other areas before you start introducing ferments or the fermenting therapy that I'm talking about. Even toxic thoughts. If you still have toxic thoughts and you're creating a stress response in your body, then you're perhaps not ready for that stress. And finally, step 5, once you've introduced the ferments from dairy, you can start to introduce the ferments from vegetable sources. Sometimes this process will be reversed. You'll actually introduce vegetable sources of fermentation prior to dairy. It does depend on the quality of the food you're able to procure. I recommend for dairy you use goat milk dairy. Don't use cow. That's more reactive than goat. And then, of course, starting with a starter culture for each of them. You could have a kefir grain starter culture for your dairy product, and you can have a vegetable starter culture for your vegetable products. But you must make sure that the goat you get the milk from is a healthy goat, grass-fed pasture-raised animal, antibiotic-free, hormone-free. And you must ensure that the vegetables you use to ferment are from a garden that has healthy soil. You best start your own garden if this is something that you need. All of this taken into account, all this information I gave you, I have a disclaimer, okay? Using these 5 steps on your own does not guarantee you're going to have the success you want if you do not know how to take the problems you're experiencing with deficiency, toxicity, and congestion into context. You need to work with a professional who understands how to problem solve in all the possible situations that may come about when you're trying to optimize your microbiome. If you like what you've just watched, you could show your support by doing one of the following. Subscribe to this channel, join my mailing list for exclusive how-to content, listen to my radio show, or follow me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or Twitter. And you can visit my website at www.transformyourselfuniversity.com.